Hi, Hannah. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me on the Sourdough Mamas podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you because you have this amazing cookbook out, and I want to touch on that a lot in this chat. But first, I want to know kind of how did you get your start in sourdough bread?
So I have this like long roundabout story about how I got started. I was working in PR for like 10 years and I got really burnt out. So one day my boyfriend was just like, just quit and take time off. Maybe you'll fall back in love with your career. So I did that. And within maybe like 3 days of not having a job and not doing anything, I got really, really bored. So I've always loved baking. And I'd never made bread before, but I saw Cooked, the documentary by Michael Pollan, and I was like a great British baking show fanatic. So I had heard about sourdough in those ways. And so I was like, let me see if I can just make my own starter. So I made my own starter, I mixed it up, and as it goes, you kind of like go along and you do your research. And I got really addicted to it. And it brought really a lot of structure during a time that I didn't really have any. So it kind of like made me organize my days around like feeding and then doing research and eventually making my own loaf.
That's awesome. Yeah, it kind of
Yeah.
gave you structure and routine where you
Yes,
didn't have any, right?
exactly.
Yeah, that's so how did you get from making your first loaf to kind of starting Make It Dough? How was that process for you?
Yeah, so I think like as a person of our generation, like social media is so much part of our existence. So it kind of I started getting really addicted to making bread and I was like and I had a marketing background, so I said, "Oh, maybe I'll start an Instagram." And then it kind of just all flowed from there, from taking pictures, and I was like, oh, like comparing my pictures to other people's and then realizing how bad they are and then like kind of learning that way. And then I started the blog just because there was so much information about sourdough even when I started, and it was all really confusing.
Yeah.
As you know, like
Yeah.
sourdough is very confusing. So the blog was just kind of a way for me to kind of take notes and kind of put down all the lessons that I was learning along the way. And then I had become part of these Facebook groups, and I would post some of the loaves that I made on there. And I really quickly started loving developing my own recipes, whether it was like discard or breads. And I would share my recipes on there, and people would always ask for my recipes. So then I was like, well, I'll just share them on the blog. And then it was kind of an instant way to get people to go on my blog by sharing my recipes on the Facebook. And then everything just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, so you had obviously really successful loaves. People wanted to replicate
Yes.
them.
Mhm.
What else were you making in the early days?
I would do a lot of the very first recipe I remember I posted on my blog was for sourdough babka.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, I know, which is to me now a little bit like ballsy.
In retrospect.
Yes, exactly. Because enriched sourdoughs are so hard to master, I feel like.
Right.
So I made a really good, I think it was like I made that really good loaf and it went really well. I was kind of like still guessing about the steps, but the bake was really successful. And yeah, and then so I kind of developed that recipe. And then after that, I started falling in love with discard recipes because the first sourdough starter that I made, like the recipe that I followed called for like 200 grams of flour.
Oh my gosh.
I know, which is
So much
insane.
discard.
I know. So then I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm wasting so much flour. And I think if you're not a person who bakes bread normally, you don't really run through flour that
Yeah.
quickly.
No, not at all.
Yeah. So I think before I started baking bread, I like a bag of flour would last me maybe like 5 months.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
was the same way. And like
yes,
then when I started into sourdough, I learned like, oh, flour can actually go bad. Like who
yes,
knew?
exactly. So yeah, so then I started falling in love with discard recipes. And so I would develop cookie recipes. I would do, my favorite still is pasta, because, you know, you can only eat so many cookies, but I love kind of the savory applications of sourdough.
Yeah. I know you have, I've probably getting the name of the recipe wrong, but you have like semolina pasta with the sourdough discard. Is that right?
Yeah.
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 So do you use a pasta roller or a pasta maker attachment or anything like that for yours? Or do you do it all by hand?
I use a pasta machine. I think it just takes so much time to just do it all by hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you can definitely do it by hand. When I was working with a company last year, and they wanted me to develop a sourdough pasta recipe for them. So I wanted to really perfect my skills at pasta making. And I started watching Evan Funke, and he's like the pasta guru. So if anybody's interested in kind of pasta making or anything like that, I would definitely recommend watching his YouTube videos. He has videos of like pasta making and on like Bon Appetit and Munchies and all that stuff. So
Oh, that's amazing. What's his name again? Evan
Funke.
Okay.
Yeah, he rolls all his pasta by hand. So if you're interested in like that process, definitely check that out.
That's I definitely will, because I was just talking to my brother-in-law last night actually about you know, pasta making and how complicated it can be, but it really, it's kind of like sourdough. It can get really complicated, but it doesn't need to be.
Yes.
Like it can be very simple. You can roll it out and cut it with a knife, you know. So it was interesting. We had just had that conversation yesterday. So I'll put a link to his videos in the show notes for anybody who is interested to check that out, because I will definitely be checking that out.
Yes, so relaxing.
Yeah, even just to watch the videos.
Yes, exactly.
Not even making the pasta. We touched really quickly on your Instagram following, and now at this point, I mean, I think you're a pretty big name in the Instagram sourdough space. You know, you have around 28,000 followers, which is amazing. What was it like kind of going from learning sourdough and kind of struggling with it to like suddenly being, I like to use this word, a sourdough fluencer?
Oh my gosh.
I totally made that word up, but I've kind of fallen in love with it.
I love it. You have to put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, that's true. Sourdough fluencer.
I mean, I think I still feel the same, just because I'm still learning every day.
Yeah.
You know, I tell people it took me like 2 years to make a good loaf. So it's like hard to be like when people struggle at first, I'm always like, well, you know, it took me 2 years to develop the skills to make a good loaf. So I still feel the same. I mean, I love the community. I love interacting with people. Nothing in like really my day-to-day has changed, except that I just get to do this for a living, which I'm so grateful for.
So fun.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that is like the biggest change from just like growing my Instagram and now to having like this big community of people who do follow me, who buy my books and all that stuff. And I'm just so grateful for it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I remember too, when I was starting out with Leavenly, you know, people would suddenly email me asking for advice, and they're asking questions. And for a long time, I kept saying like, well, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. And then I had to kind of shift that, because I guess like eventually I kind of became, I still don't like to say it, but I feel like there's a certain point where you know more than most people when they're starting out. And but I still kind of like you, I think I'm hesitant to say the word expert.
Yeah, you kind of like shrink away from it. I kind of felt you like shrinking away from it, like I do. I think it's, you know, it's hard to say you're an expert because sourdough teaches us something every day.
That's very true. I'm forever learning.
Like, it's every day that you make a loaf. It's like, oh, you know, I need to do that for my loaves to turn out well. You know, and then you have the odd loaf that doesn't turn out well still.
Yeah,
like, to this day, I'm just like, what did I do? You know.
For me, it's when you take off the lid of the Dutch oven. I'm still crossing my fingers like, please work, please work.
Yes. No, I'm never like, oh, this is gonna be a perfect loaf. And sometimes like when you have that really perfect dome with like the huge ear, you know, it still surprises me to this day. You know, I probably shouldn't say that because I have a book out.
Well, I think it speaks kind of to the unpredictable nature of sourdough too, that,
Yes.
even those with cookbooks out, even those so-called experts and
Mhm.
sourdough fluencers, we still, and we all still kind of pull out sometimes a loaf that we consider not as perfect and not as great as
Mhm.
most of our loaves. But I think what I like to kind of say all the time is, like, at the end of the day, it's delicious and it's edible, and you made that from
Mhm.
scratch and you're feeding your family.
Yes.
So what could possibly be better? And it's a
Right.
little bonus when it looks really beautiful too.
It's always a delight when your loaf comes out perfectly. But yeah, I always say, like, watch your fermentation. That's all you really need to know. But that's kind of hard to, convey to people.
It is. It's a hard concept to grasp, especially
Mhm.
when you might be used to making yeasted doughs, and
Mhm.
then they say, let the dough double. And with sourdough, it's not really advisable to let it fully double. And then
Mhm.
you have to explain why and kind of go into fermentation. And I think at that point, a lot of people are like, "Ooh, this is
Glaze
way over my
over.
head." Yeah, like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? So I
Yeah.
I also appreciate, like, the simplicity of
Mhm.
sourdough, like making it simple for people.
It's
Yeah. So
also
how?
hard
Oh, sorry.
because
Go ahead.
just from like learning online, I think people go after the big bubbles, but when you're starting out, the big bubbles probably are the result of under fermentation.
Yes. Yeah.
So
It's,
I
yeah,
think that
under
is a huge,
fermentation
yeah,
versus open crumb, right?
yeah. I think that's the biggest difference from learning the craft like we did from online is you can kind of diagnose exactly what's wrong with other people's bread just from looking at a picture, which I
Yes.
think is like the biggest difference from when I first started to now. Because
Interesting.
yeah, so people will ask me like all the time on DMs or whatever, and say, I don't know what happened with my loaf. I followed your recipe, it's kind of dense and gummy. And then I'm like, well, I wasn't in your kitchen. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly what happened. You could follow a recipe, but your kitchen could be cold, your kitchen could be warm. There's a lot of things that could have happened. But I always ask people to send me a picture, and then you can kind of like almost immediately diagnose what happened.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very true. Just even
Mhm.
from seeing the inside and the outside. I think the inside
Yes.
is a bigger, you can tell more from the inside than the outside.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's always like, even for the outside, because I do a lot of intricate scoring, when people show me photos of their loaves and the scoring didn't come out exactly the way that they want, it's always a proofing issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Why did
Mhm.
my dough burst through my scores?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or like
Hmm.
the designs look a little scraggly,
Right.
and then it's because you didn't get that perfect you you didn't get the perfect Maillard reaction. Your loaf didn't bloom as best as it could. The crust is a little thicker, so
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just all
There's so many
connected.
variables.
Yes, exactly.
And so how did that play into your recipe creation? Like, with
Mhm.
creating the cookbook, was that kind of a challenge with creating recipes and, kind of wondering, shoot, I hope this works for other people as well as it worked for me. Was that ever like a concern? Or what was the
It
recipe creation process like for you?
it really was, but I think that's an anxiety I always have every time that I put out a recipe, especially in the age of the internet.
Right.
Where people can, like bash your book or whatever. But I always just try to think that, hopefully everybody's kind of like me, where I never blame, the Michelin star chef that I like. Not that I'm saying I'm like that, but I never blame the chef for getting the recipe wrong, because I know I don't have their abilities.
Right. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, like kind of gosh, foolproof baking, Kristen at
Hmm.
foolproof baking, she has, I mean, when you look at her loaves, they're just like otherworldly, just how perfect they are all the time. But I know that even if I follow her process, I'm not going to get her exact crumb.
Right.
I'm going to get
Hmm.
close. And like I think the best loaves I've ever made is like when I set aside like a good amount of time and just am able to focus on a loaf, and I follow her process exactly. Like, I'll get my best crumb, but you
Yeah.
know, it's just, it's not, my loaves turn out well, but it's just like not like hers, where you just it's just perfect all the way around. You can't like find fault in it.
Right. I mean, you don't have her starter, you don't have her kitchen.
Yes, exactly. I don't have her hands.
Yes, exactly. And her knowledge. I remember she shared once on her Instagram, I think, that she takes these beautiful pictures of her bread, and they're always like the holes in her crumb are just so well highlighted, and there's shadows,
Yes,
and
yeah.
it looks so nice. And she shared once that she literally walks around with the loaf in her hand around her house with her phone in her hand, like looking for the best light, and she's turning in different ways. And she took one picture like with the bread sitting on her stairs.
Yes.
That's where the good light was. And so
That's
that
so
kind of opened
funny.
my eyes. I was like, oh, that's a great idea. Go chase the light in your
Yeah.
house. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was
Yeah.
funny. I love like behind the scenes stuff like that, like hearing that little story.
Mhm.
So again, I kind of want to touch on your recipe process and your testing process, because I
Yeah,
think that's
sure.
a little bit of like a behind the scenes
Mhm.
thing. I'm fascinated by it. Like I have zero concept of what it takes to make a cookbook. So do you mind like kind of walking us through
Yeah,
that
of
process?
course.
Like what was it
Yeah.
like?
So I think the very first step if you want to be a recipe developer, the very first step that you need to take is to understand baker's percentages. So if for those who don't know, baker's percentages is basically the percent of an ingredient compared to flour in a recipe. So if you have a recipe that calls for 1,000 grams of flour and 600 grams of water, that means it's 60% water.
Yeah.
And or if it has 100 grams of sugar, then it's 10%, 10% sugar. So that's kind of what the framework that you have to work in. People say baking is a science, and it's because basically recipes are formulas.
Yes.
And once you understand that, there's a little bit of leeway in adjusting the sugar content, adjusting the flour content, but you have to understand that what makes a cake is that it has this amount of feel like a cake in your mouth. I mean, is because it has this amount of sugar, it has this amount of flour, it has this amount of fat. So you kind of have to start from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you have that, then you can kind of make anything you want. So people ask me about recipe development all the time, and my process is just basically starting with a spreadsheet.
That's
like
that makes sense.
Yeah, a Google spreadsheet, and I will I'll research maybe like 20 recipes online just to kind of see what are the percentages that people use for a chocolate cake, for example. Like how much average is like cocoa or fat or sugar in a particular recipe.
And you keep track of all those on the spreadsheet?
Yes. Yeah. And then I'll do all my own math or whatever. And then I'll also research like what effect a certain ingredient has on a cake, for example. Like what effect does, adding baking soda and baking powder together have on a cake versus skipping one?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or for example, with a chocolate cake recipe I developed recently, it was like, what effect does adding melted chocolate have versus a lot of recipes just do cocoa powder?
Yeah, right.
So what effect does that have on the mouthfeel? Because that's where I always start from, is like, what do I like, So when I think about the chocolate cakes that I love growing up, were they spongy or were they a little bit fudgy?
Oh, interesting.
Because like the amount of fat that you put, the type of fat and the amount of fat that you put in your recipe, or like the amount of chocolate and the type of chocolate you put in your recipe kind of changes based on that.
Interesting. You're making me really hungry and wanting chocolate cake now.
You need to make the chocolate cake recipe on my blog. It's my absolute favorite cake.
Oh, I will. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's the recipe called, just offhand? Or can I just search chocolate cake?
It's just the sourdough discard chocolate cake.
Perfect. I definitely will. I love chocolate cake, like more than the next guy. It's my favorite. It's probably top 5 favorite dessert, maybe even top 3.
Yeah, it's so easy too, because I'm not a cake decorator. I can't do the piping or the fuzzy stuff. So that one is just a single layer ganache, ganache icing with chocolate shavings on top. It's so good.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And it probably looks really impressive too, just even based on how you're explaining it.
Yeah, it's so simple.
Yeah.
But yeah, so after, I kind of decide that, I'll go through a few my cat is in here. It's crying.
I was just gonna say, do I hear a cat?
Yeah, let me let her out. 1 second, sorry.
Okay. That's okay. She wants some chocolate cake.
Yeah.
Pets are unpredictable. I locked my dog in the bedroom, which is like 4 or 5 rooms away. So in case he barks, you won't be able to hear him.
There you go. I'm back.
Pet emergency. We understand.
I know she's been crying. But yeah, so where were we? So basically after that, I'll go through a few rounds of testing. I like to do at least 2 or 3 if I can.
What does that entail? Is it you testing it? Do other people test it? How does that work?
I tested all on my own. I think like I don't have a big enough team yet, or ability to be like, oh, can you please make a commitment to test this recipe for me?
Right.
I think I could probably like work on building that infrastructure. I just haven't. But yeah, so I just tested all myself. Either, the recipe comes out perfect the first time, and then I'll kind of repeat it and see if it comes out the same. Or if there's something that I didn't like the first time. For example, that chocolate cake recipe, I think the first time that I made it, it was too fudgy and brownie-like.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, and
Right.
then when I had it, I thought it was really good. But I think when you think about a chocolate cake, people have an expectation of it being a little bit spongy.
Yeah.
And having a little bit more of a looser crumb versus, a tight crumb of a fudge brownie.
Yeah.
So I had to, reformulate the recipe and retest it again with kind of little adjustments that I make just based on research that I did to kind of adjust the chemical leaveners, the amount of chocolate that I put in the recipe, to kind of get it to the finish line of like what I want it to turn out as.
Yeah. Darn,
Yeah,
that must have been really hard testing all that chocolate cake. It sounds terrible.
You would think it would be like great, but I was so sick of chocolate.
Oh.
Especially in February when like all the brands want you to develop chocolate recipes for them.
Oh, right. Yeah. And you're like, no more chocolate, please.
Yes, exactly.
Give me all of the pasta.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a fun one to develop. And I think that was really one of the ones that I could really play around with and, change different things about it.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like so much fun. And so once you kind of perfect it and you're like, yeah, this is it, you would kind of move on to the next, or are you doing them all simultaneously? Or
I really focus on one at a time. I think you have to. It's really, I bet people can do multiple testings at once, but I really can't. You know what? The process for me is within a given month, I'll have my assignments based on like the brands that I'm working with, or my Patreon, or the blog, stuff that I want to do for the blog. Or if it's for Instagram, it's usually stuff that I want to eat, stuff that I'm craving, because I get to play around with that a little bit more.
Yeah, that gives you some more freedom, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll have kind of like my working, recipes that I want to do every month at the beginning of the month. And then I'll basically do the research step of each recipe. I like if I'm being very productive, then I'll sit down on my computer and do that research step of like looking up, 20 recipes online and comparing them and researching each. And then I'll write up the recipe formulas for each recipe that I want to do during a month. And then throughout the month, I'll kind of work on testing and developing each recipe.
Makes sense.
Yeah, based on kind of due dates and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that just seems so fun. And gosh, I can't. So, I mean, okay, we haven't even mentioned the name of the cookbook yet, or maybe I have, but it's called Sourdough Every Day, Your Guide to Using Active and Discard Starter for Artisan Bread, Rolls, Pasta, Sweets, and more. And so it's mostly discard. Is that right? Yeah,
Yes.
but there are some active starter recipes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know you have sourdough bread in there, how to shape
Mm-hmm.
it and stuff like that, which is so
Mm-hmm.
helpful. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so what was the process like even doing pictures? Like how do you hire a photographer to come take pictures? Did you have to go into a studio? I'm like picking your brain here. I'm like,
Yeah.
how does it work? How does it all work?
So people are always super interested in the process of the book. So I guess I can start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, my publisher actually reached out to me, basically just inviting me to write a book. So we kind of had discussions on like the topics that they wanted me to write about and kind of basically what I was interested in. And then once we cemented a topic for the book, I had to write kind of a short proposal on just with, a sample table of contents. And then I had to write up one chapter.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had to write up like a chapter, introduction for one chapter, and then the recipes that would go under that chapter. And then I think I had to turn in either between 1 to 3 recipes. I don't really recall. So I turned that in, and then once they approve it, then you get the offer, and then you write the book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then you
And I'm
sign the
assuming there's
contract
like
and
a
everything.
deadline.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have a deadline, and you were asking about the photography. At that point, my photography wasn't like that great, so I wasn't super comfortable taking the photos myself. So we did hire a photographer that was in Las Vegas. So they budgeted an amount to pay me as the author, and then an amount to pay the photographer as well.
Okay.
So yeah, so they sent me a list of photographers that were in Las Vegas, but they weren't really like matching my style. So I kind of like looked on my own, and the photographer that I ended up going with, she's actually a wedding photographer, but she had I think I don't even know how I found her. I think I just Googled Las Vegas food photographer and just looked through all the links and like found one that I liked. And it was really funny because we actually were doing this during COVID. So she became part of my COVID circle because she is a very good photographer, and for like the amount that the publisher budgeted for her wasn't going to really make sense.
Okay.
But because of COVID, all of her gigs were canceled.
Oh yeah, of course,
So
right?
it was
Weddings,
kind of like
get-togethers.
I don't know, like lucky for me and lucky
Yeah,
for her too, because
right.
she was like, I want to make it work, but like it's really like, I can't, it doesn't make sense like money wise. But because all of her other stuff was canceled, it was kind of just like a way for the both of us to have this like huge dream that we both had come true.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
she
that's
was
kind of,
like,
I mean, it's sad here, like the
yes,
pandemic, COVID, everything was so awful, but there are like tiny silver linings in there. And
exactly.
this sounds
Yeah.
like one of those stories.
Yeah. And I think that's the same way for like a lot of things that happened during COVID is, a lot of people had to reframe their minds around like what money is worth to them, work versus passion and stuff. So, it was kind of like a good example of that for both of us.
Yeah.
Because she definitely could not have done the book because she stays booked with weddings. And even at the tail end of, the process of us shooting the book together, things were kind of opening up at the end of the process. So like she was getting booked for gigs, and I was like, no.
I want you all to myself.
Exactly. So because before that I would have her for a whole weekend, and after that, like during the tail end, she was just like, well, I can only do it from like 11 to 3 today or whatever, so
Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm glad we kind of meshed together on that, because I don't like, she did it better than I could even picture it in my brain. So she was definitely an amazing creative partner.
Yeah, I mean the pictures in your book are fantastic. Even the process photos of your hands folding the dough,
Mhm.
it's so clear and so detailed and so bright. It's very obvious like what you need to be doing at that point. So yeah, she did an
Yes,
excellent
she's
job.
incredible.
Yeah.
She is incredible.
Hmm. And was that the only time you had to work with someone during the pandemic? Because you mentioned you did all this during COVID.
Mhm.
I'm assuming the rest of it was kind of just you working at home. But was there
Yes.
any more like times you needed to get together during the pandemic? Did that play a role at all?
No, she was really the only one outside of my COVID circle that who became part of my COVID circle, um, that I had to work with because I definitely work solo. I work from home.
Yeah.
I do everything myself. Well, now I do all my own photography too. So yeah, so I would basically bake a batch of things for her to photograph on Saturday or Friday. And I'd bake like 5 loaves of bread and then I'd bring it to her house and then we'd photograph it all.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I would kind of snap pictures of what I made for her, and I would kind of tell her what would be important to capture. For example, like if it's like a streusel coffee cake or something, like the texture on the on top of the coffee cake would be really important. And then she would kind of have all the design boards and all the style boards ready for me when I
Hmm.
got there. And then we just plop it down on the boards and then she would take pictures.
Oh, that's really cool. I love like
Yeah.
the insight of behind the scenes. I love that stuff because
Yes.
like I said, I just
Yeah.
have like I can remember when I was a kid and the show How It's Made came out. Have you ever seen
Mhm.
that?
My boyfriend loves that show.
Yeah, I think I might have just dated myself because that's like it was literally the first season. I was obsessed
Yeah.
with it, and I still am. I love knowing how things work, and I always say like I would love to see a film or documentary on Amazon and like how I can possibly place an order in the morning and it's on my porch in the
Oh, I
afternoon.
know. It's insane,
How
isn't it?
how I don't know. I don't understand it. So I love the behind the scenes. Sorry,
Mhm.
major tangent, but I appreciate you letting us know kind of how that went for you. And also, something that we kind of touched on is the sourdough discard recipes.
Yes.
We talk
Mhm.
about that a lot on the Sourdough Mamas group on Facebook.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
have a big group of a lot of home bakers, and people are doing their own recipes. They're baking other recipes, and I even did a podcast on it actually a couple episodes ago. It's a big topic.
Mhm.
Because people don't want to waste their discard.
Yeah.
Um, so was that the same kind of process, like, you wanted to kinda make something that appealed to you, or how did you like, is there any recipes you made that you wouldn't necessarily ever make yourself?
No.
No? I love it.
Absolutely not, because we have to eat it.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's always where I start. Like even in the whole recipe development process, I always start with what do I want to eat?
that's fair. Yeah.
You know, and I mean now it kind of with my blog, SEO kind of plays a little bit of a role with what I make now for my blog. Only that like it needs to be, people need to be searching for it to make sense.
Mhm.
For me to work on it, but it's always stuff that I want to eat. I never make anything that I wouldn't eat myself. So
Well, that's fair, because then that way you can kinda vouch for it too, right?
yes, exactly.
Yeah. And how
Yeah.
so would you look at something and say like, "Geez, that would be really good as a discard recipe. I wonder how I could do that." What
Yes,
like yeah, was that
that is
basically like, "Hey,
exactly what I
how can
do.
I add discard to this recipe?"
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think discard is such a touchy subject for sourdough people because some
Oh, you think
people,
so?
yes, because there are some people that say, you shouldn't have discard if you're using your sourdough starter properly, or
Oh, okay, yeah.
you've seen this argument.
Yes, yeah, and it's like, if you feed your starter, though, you will have discard, you know?
Yes. Yeah,
And if you're not
exactly.
baking bread every single day, I mean, most of us
Mhm.
aren't, home bakers certainly aren't.
Yeah.
Mhm,
And I mean, I think there's just that whole argument about it. Or some people say, like, does it really benefit the bake to put discard in it? And so I think that's like a whole argument that people have online that I've seen. But for me, I think about it this way: baking for me now with discard is kind of like cooking with bay leaves at this point, because with bay leaves, you don't really know that it's there, but you know when it's not. And and
interesting.
whenever I bake anything now, it's always a challenge for me to transform it into a discard recipe. There's not a lot of stuff that I make that doesn't have discard in it. So when if I ever made something without discard, I'm always like, well, it's missing that certain like tang or certain element that I usually have when I, bake something.
Yeah. Yeah. I can completely attest to that. You notice when it's not there. That was really well
Yes.
said, but you don't really notice when it is there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You just kind of like taste something missing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's obviously like if you're making sourdough pasta and you're letting it ferment for a really long time, then you get kind of the same benefits that you would get from, a sourdough bread where it's like very long fermented. It's better for your stomach, all of these things. But I think I always say, let people do what they want to do in their own kitchens.
That's what I think too. It's like, hey, you want to do that? You go for it. Why not?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm like, I sometimes will see like a discard police post on Instagram.
I like that.
And I always just roll my eyes and I'm like, well, you know what? If you don't want to put it in, you don't have to. Nobody is going in your kitchen making you put discard on everything you make.
Yeah. I think that's the case kind of with everything, parenting. Certainly people always have opinions about parenting, and it's like, well, if you don't like it, just keep scrolling. You don't need to type out what you think. You can just keep going.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I love that though, the discard police. That's kind of funny.
That's another t-shirt.
Yeah. Look, we're gonna just like design a t-shirt line right now.
I know, exactly.
That's funny. So you kind of just recently wrapped up your partnership with Challenger, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were you were kind of their brand ambassador. Was it for a full year?
I think it was 6 months. 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what did that entail? What were you responsible for? And did you get to meet Jim?
Yes. Yes. And it was amazing. So basically I was an ambassador for Challenger breadware and I was the recipe developer every month. So since I have the ability to do recipe development, right, and take food photos, it was really easy for us to kind of have a partnership that way, because for a brand to do all these things themselves is really difficult. Challenger has a really talented team who can do everything, but I think it gets, like if you do a whole production, it gets a little bit more expensive than just kind of hiring it out to independent contractor, because I can just do everything myself. And then I'll always turn the recipes in on time. You'll have the same amount of photos that you requested, and you have a recipe that's been tested. So that's kind of what I did for Challenger. Every month I would develop one recipe. I'll take, a group of photos, and then they have access to those photos. They can use them in their marketing or whatever they need them for. And then I would be responsible for promoting the product in like a specific number of posts every month.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm. And then, and then I also got the chance to travel to Chicago to meet Jim. So I think we did 2 days of like shooting videos and like kind of just, getting to know each other, talking about all the nerdy bread things that you want to talk about. And I will say this about Jim, he is nicer in person than he is online.
There's no way. I've talked to him 3 different times over Zoom. There's no way he could possibly be nicer.
It's incredible. Like, it's just unreal, like that there could be a person that's this nice, but that's Jim. Yeah.
He is as nice. And that's kind of why I was like, did you get to meet him? Because I'm dying to meet him. Yeah.
He is as nice and genuine in person. Well, he's actually nicer and more genuine in person than he comes across online.
That's just amazing, because he really is like the nicest person.
Oh, he's incredible.
That's so cool to do that partnership with them. And man, talk about trailblazing, right?
Yes.
Their Challenger bread pan, even their Baker's Technique website now, the portion of their website is super helpful. It's just they are trailblazers and they're just amazing at what they do. So that must have been really fun to be a part of that.
It really was. And I think it was just very fascinating to pick his brain, because he's such an entrepreneur to start with. And that's, like not a lot of people are like that. So kind of just very inspiring to kind of get from the process of him, discovering sourdough, like all the things he does with it, and then starting Challenger Breadware was super fascinating. So I'm really glad that I got to work with Jim, and that's like one of my dream partners. And so I was super grateful that I got to do that last year.
Yeah, that's very, very cool.
Mhm.
I love to ask people this question, even like just like sourdough mamas I talk to, like that have been baking a couple of years, even and like the sourdough fluencers. Is there anything, looking back, is there anything that you would do differently?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say
'Cause,
because
yeah, there are so many mistakes in sourdough, but
yeah,
it's like that's kind of what got you here. That's
yes.
why I love this question.
hmm I don't know. I mean, I think, oh, the one thing that I would do different would be to just do one recipe, perfect one bread recipe before you kind of add mix-ins or, add more ingredients, work with different flours. I would definitely master one recipe first, because then you kind of get the feel for the dough and you kind of get an understanding of what each step in the process should be like. Because I think if like how I did it, where I was just so excited to, it felt like when I learned about baker's percentage, it was just like opened my eyes to like everything. I just felt like I wanted to just like grab at everything and like try everything new. But I think it kind of hindered me from really perfecting the skill of making bread. So I think if I were to do it over, I would definitely just focus on one recipe and make that over and over again. Because then it kind of helps you understand what you need to do to be able to like change it. You need to know the rules before you can break them, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And your hands will learn the dough better. They'll be able to learn when it's fermented well and when it's not,
Mhm.
without the added influence of inclusions or other ingredients.
Yes.
But yeah, that's
Yeah.
great advice. I'm like, I'm the opposite. I find one recipe and I stick to it, and
Yes.
I like to be able to do it with my eyes closed and the kids running around
Uh-huh.
screaming and I don't even have to think about it.
Yes.
So if I do try something new, it's completely out of my comfort zone.
Yeah, you like start panicking.
Yes, I'm like, I'm gonna miss a step. So yeah, I actually have bread proofing in the fridge right now that I'm gonna bake later today. It's just my normal sourdough recipe, but I
Mhm.
replaced 25 grams of water with olive oil, which I've never done before.
Ooh,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I was like, why not? Maybe it'll improve the crust. I don't know. Just trying it. And again, like it's such a tiny baby step, but that's how I function.
I'm the same way. I just developed the recipe for olive ciabatta, and I had tried ciabatta before and I completely failed at it. So this time I'm like, but it came out really well. So
Good.
mhm.
Yeah, I don't know what my goal is here. I just kind of want to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
excited to see what you think. I think I kind of know how it's going to turn out, but
Oh, but you're not going to tell
I'll.
me?
So, do you want me to tell you?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes. Okay. So, uh, adding fat to bread kind of tenderizes the crumb.
Right.
So you'll get something. It'll still have the bubbles if you did everything right, but it'll be a little bit softer, and the crust won't be as crusty. It would kind of feel like it should feel a little bit like focaccia.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that kind of like chewiness, that
Right.
mouthfeel of chewiness, but like
Right.
still the sponginess in the crumb. So
Yeah,
it'll
yeah,
change it a little bit,
I got the
especially with
inspiration because
20%.
my last podcast episode I did sourdough problems, some like common
Mhm.
challenges people deal with, and one of them is my crust is way too hard. How can I soften it?
Mm.
And I looked through the group for like suggestions that the sourdough mamas gave, and that was one to bake it with olive oil. And I was thinking, that
Mhm.
wouldn't be so hard. That's an easy add-on that I can do with the chaos in my house.
Yes,
So yeah, I'm
yeah.
interested to see, but yes, I'll definitely keep you posted.
Yeah, another one, my biggest tip though for that problem would be to bake your bread covered for longer. Because I think a lot of recipes call for baking your bread with steam for 20 minutes, and then baking it uncovered without steam for like another 20 or 10 minutes. But I always bake mine for 30 because my boyfriend really likes a thin crust. And I think obviously, the thickness of the crust has to do with the proofing and like the way that you treat your dough. But I think it's a good way to get a crust that's not so thick and hard, even if you don't get everything right.
Yeah. It keeps the steam around the outside of the bread for longer.
Yeah. So I usually, what I do is bake for 30 minutes covered and then 10 minutes uncovered.
Yeah. That's actually about what I do. I do 30 and then about 13 uncovered, more or less.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's awesome. Any other final thoughts or anything you'd like to add? Any sourdough mama advice?
I think we basically talked about everything.
Yeah, we did. We covered a lot. It's been really fun. What's the best way to direct people to be able to find you?
So I'm always on Instagram at Make It Dough. You can message me on there if you have any sourdough questions. If you want any baking ideas, I always usually put my ideas on Instagram first. And then my blog, makeitdough.com. And then I'm also on Patreon at Make It Dough, patreon.com/makeitdough. That's just it's $10 a month for my recipe club members. You get 2 recipes each month. And access to the entire library of recipes that I have been working on for basically a year now. So that's 24 recipes. And the great thing about the Patreon is that you get to be part of my recipe club chat where you have instant access to my primary inbox. So if you have any sourdough troubleshooting questions, you can shoot it over to me and you won't kind of get stuck in that limbo of message requests.
Right.
That everybody has.
Where they get missed for months. Yes.
And then I kind of give first priority to my recipe club members on if there's, a type of cake that you have always dreamt about that you want to turn into a sourdough cake, then I'll develop it and share it with the recipe club. So
that's very cool.
And then you get to vote on, the recipes that get developed for the next month. So it's a fun little community, another way to support my work if, you choose to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's great. I'll put links to all those things in the show notes.
Yeah, of course, so I'll email you.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I can, you guys, the listeners, you guys can check out leavenly.com/podcast and you can find the show notes there. Hannah, this has been really amazing. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah, it absolutely was. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.